I sat down to dinner with them and placed my wife's locket beside my plate. My daughter-in-law picked it up and said, "You still cling to that dead woman like she's coming back." My son laughed. "He's sentimental like that." I sat quietly. But that night she found a video on her phone, sent from an unknown number, that played a message she never wanted anyone to hear. I used to believe my life had already reached its quiet ending. Not the kind that comes with tragedy or sudden loss, but the slow, steady kind. The kind where everything important has already happened and all that remains is routine. Morning coffee, the same creaking floorboards, the same chair by the window where sunlight fell just right around noon. And memories. Especially her. My wife Elena had been gone for 6 years by then. Cancer, the slow kind that teaches you how to say goodbye long before the final moment arrives. We had time, too much of it maybe. Time to talk, to cry, to pretend everything was still normal even when it was. When she passed, she left me one thing she made me promise never to lose. Her locket. It was simple, oval-shaped, gold, slightly worn around the edges. Inside was a picture of the two of us from when we were young, before life became schedules and responsibilities, before everything started slipping through our fingers. I wore it every day for the first year after she died. After that, I kept it close, not around my neck anymore, but always in my pocket or placed carefully beside me wherever I sat, especially at meals. It became a habit. Or maybe a ritual. I never really thought about it much, it just felt wrong not to. My son Daniel didn't understand that. To be fair, I never expected him to. Daniel had always been practical. Even as a child, he preferred logic over emotion. If something broke, you fixed it. If something ended, you moved on. That was how he saw the world. And in many ways, it served him well. He built a career in finance, climbed steadily through the ranks, and eventually landed a senior position at a firm in Chicago. Clean suits, sharp mind, decisive voice. The kind of man people trusted with numbers and ignored when it came to feelings. We weren't distant, but we weren't close either. Not after Elena passed. Grief does that, it reshapes relationships in quiet, permanent ways. Then came Vanessa, my daughter-in-law. Daniel met her at a corporate event. She worked in marketing, sharp, articulate, always composed. The kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately take control of it without raising her voice. The first time I met her, she smiled warmly. Too warmly. I noticed that right away. Not because I distrusted her, but because I had spent 40 years with a woman whose smiles were always honest. And once you've known that kind of sincerity, you start recognizing the difference. Vanessa's smile was practiced. Precise. Like something she adjusted depending on who she was speaking to. Still, I kept my thoughts to myself. Daniel seemed happy. And at my age, you learn that your role changes. You stop interfering. You stop correcting. You let people live their lives even if you see things they don't. They married within a year. Small ceremony, elegant, efficient. Very them. After the wedding, they moved into a house about 30 minutes from mine. Modern, clean lines, open spaces, everything looked like it belonged in a magazine. They invited me over often enough. Sunday dinners, mostly. At first, I thought it was kindness. Then I realized it was routine. Daniel liked structure, Vanessa liked appearances. Having the widowed father over for dinner once a week fit neatly into both. I didn't mind. Truth is, I was lonely. And even if our conversations stayed shallow, even if there were long stretches of silence filled only by the clinking of utensils and polite remarks, it was still something. It was still family. That night started like any other. I arrived at exactly 6 o'clock. Vanessa opened the door before I even knocked. She always did that, timing things down to the second. It gave the illusion that she had been waiting for you, even if you knew she had simply been watching through the window. "Good evening," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "Evening," I replied. Daniel appeared shortly after, adjusting his cufflinks as he walked in. "Dad," he said with a nod. No hug. That wasn't his way. Dinner was already set. 3 plates, 3 glasses, everything aligned perfectly. And at my usual seat, at the far end of the table, I placed the locket beside my plate. Just like always. For a while, everything was normal. We talked about neutral things, the weather, Daniel's work, a new development project near their neighborhood. Vanessa contributed at all the right moments. She laughed when appropriate, asked questions that made her seem engaged. It was rehearsed. But again, I said nothing. Then it happened. It was a small moment. The kind most people would forget instantly. Vanessa reached across the table, her fingers brushing the edge of my plate as she picked up the locket. She held it between her thumb and forefinger, examining it like it was a curiosity she had just discovered. "You still keep this with you?" she asked. Her tone wasn't curious. It was something else. Before I could answer, she tilted her head slightly and added, "You still cling to that dead woman like she's coming back." Daniel laughed. A short, casual sound. "He's sentimental like that," he said, cutting into his steak as if nothing unusual had been said. I didn't respond. Not immediately. I simply reached out, took the locket from Vanessa's hand, and placed it back beside my plate. Carefully, gently, as if it were something fragile. The conversation continued. Or at least they continued talking. I don't remember what they said after that. Not clearly. Because in that moment, something shifted. Not anger. Not even hurt. Those feelings come quickly and loudly. What I felt was quieter. Colder. Like a door closing somewhere deep inside. I had spent 6 years being patient. 6 years accepting distance, accepting indifference, accepting that people move on in ways you might not. But there's a difference between moving on and disrespect. That night I stayed for dessert. I thanked Vanessa for the meal. I nodded to Daniel. And I left exactly at 8 o'clock. Just like always. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I sat in the dark living room, the locket resting in my palm. For a long time, I said nothing. Did nothing. Just the thought. Then slowly, I stood up and walked to the study. Opened the drawer. And took out something I hadn't touched in years. A small external hard drive. I stared at it for a moment. Then I connected it to my laptop. The screen flickered to life. Folders, dates, names, and one file in particular. I clicked it. The video loaded. I watched it once. Then again. And by the third time, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. Because Vanessa was right about one thing. I was sentimental. But she had no idea just how far that sentiment went. The video wasn't something I had stumbled upon. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't even something I had forgotten. It was something I had chosen to bury. For a very long time. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the laptop casting faint shadows across the walls of my study. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, forcing you to listen to your own thoughts whether you want to or not. The video sat paused at the first frame. Vanessa, younger but unmistakable. Her hair shorter, her voice slightly less controlled, but the same precision in her posture, the same calculated calm in her eyes. I exhaled slowly and pressed play again. It had been recorded 8 years ago. 2 years before Daniel ever met her. Back when I was still consulting part-time for a compliance firm. Nothing glamorous, just contract work, reviewing internal audits, identifying discrepancies, flagging potential legal risks. The kind of work companies hired you for when they needed someone quiet and thorough. That case had come through a mid-sized marketing agency. Bright Edge Strategies. At the time, it looked routine. Minor financial inconsistencies, some irregular vendor payments, a few missing approvals. Nothing unusual until you start pulling at the threads. That's when her name first appeared. Vanessa Clark. Director of Client Acquisition. She wasn't the focus at first. Just one name among many. But the deeper I went, the more often it came up. Approvals routed through her department. Vendor relationships tied back to her contacts. Contracts signed off under her authority. And then there was the video. It hadn't been meant for me. It was sent anonymously to the firm's internal ethics line, a tip from someone who clearly knew more than they were saying. Most anonymous tips are useless. Vague accusations. Personal grudges disguised as whistleblowing. But this one included evidence. Clear, direct, undeniable. The video showed Vanessa sitting in what looked like a private office. Across from her was a man I later identified as a vendor representative. They were discussing numbers. Not official numbers. Adjusted ones. Inflated contracts. Kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. And then, near the end of the video, her voice dropped slightly. Calmer. Sharper. She said, as long as everything routes through my approvals, no one will question it. They trust me to keep things clean. I remember pausing the video the first time I watched it. Not because I was shocked, but because I recognized something. That same tone. That same controlled confidence. The same one I heard years later across the dinner table. The investigation that followed was complicated. Not because the evidence wasn't there. It was, but companies don't always want truth. They want resolution. Quiet resolution. BrightEdge conducted an internal review. Limited scope. Carefully managed. And in the end, Vanessa wasn't charged. Wasn't exposed. Wasn't even formally accused. She resigned, pursuing new opportunities. That's how they phrased it. The vendor contracts were quietly terminated. A few mid-level employees were blamed for oversight failures. And the case was closed. I filed my report. Documented everything. Submitted the video as supporting evidence. And then I moved on. Or at least I thought I did. Years later, when Daniel first mentioned her name, I didn't make the connection. Not immediately. Vanessa, he said casually over the phone, I've been seeing someone. It's a common name. There was no reason to assume anything. It wasn't until I met her in person that something clicked. Not a memory. A feeling. That subtle sense of familiarity you can't quite place. I went home that night and pulled up the old case files. Scrolled through the archived folders. And there she was. Same eyes. Same voice. Same controlled smile. I sat there for a long time. Staring at the screen. Trying to decide what to do. I could have told Daniel. Laid everything out. Shown him the video. Explained exactly who he was involved with. But I didn't. Because evidence doesn't always matter in matters of the heart. And Daniel had already chosen her. If I had come forward then, it wouldn't have been seen as concern. It would have been seen as interference. As suspicion. As jealousy, even. A widowed father projecting distrust onto his son's happiness. I knew how that would end. He wouldn't believe me. Or worse, he would believe me and resent me for it anyway. So I made a decision. A quiet one. The kind you don't announce. You simply carry it with you. I copied the video. Stored it separately. Kept it somewhere safe. And I waited. Not for revenge. Not yet. Just for clarity. People reveal themselves over time. Patterns repeat. Choices echo. And truth has a way of resurfacing when it's least convenient. Over the next few years I watched. Listened. paid attention. Vanessa was careful. Very careful. But not perfect. No one is. Small things stood out. Conversations that ended too quickly when I entered the room. Phone calls she took outside. The way she deflected certain questions, not directly but skillfully. Redirecting, reframing. Daniel never noticed. Or if he did, he dismissed it. He trusted her. Completely. And I said nothing. Until that night. That single sentence at the dinner table. You still cling to that dead woman like she's coming back. It wasn't just disrespect. It was arrogance. The kind that comes from believing you're untouchable. That your past is buried. That no one sees what you've done. She didn't know who I was. Not really. Not beyond Daniel's father. A quiet, agging man with sentimental habits. She didn't know I had already seen her at her worst. Years before she ever stepped into my son's life. And Daniel. His laughter told me everything I needed to know. Not cruelty. Just alignment. He had chosen his side. Even if he didn't realize it. That night, sitting in my study, watching the video for the third time. I understood something very clearly. This wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the present. And the future. Because people like Vanessa don't change. They adapt. They refine. They become more careful. More convincing. But eventually, they slip. And when they do, it matters who's watching. I closed the laptop slowly. The room fell silent again. Then I reached for my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and stopped on a name I hadn't spoken to in years. A former colleague. Someone who understood investigations. Someone who knew how to look deeper. Without being seen. I hesitated for only a moment. Then I made the call. Because if Vanessa believed her past was buried, she was about to learn just how shallow that grave really was. The days after that call were strange. It's difficult to describe the tension of living with a secret that could shatter everything around you, especially when the people involved are so close to you. Every laugh, every casual glance, every routine gesture suddenly takes on a weight you never noticed before. You notice the rhythm of their lives, the small habits, the way they interact, the tiny cracks that reveal their true selves. I began visiting Daniel and Vanessa more often, not out of concern but out of observation. Nothing overt. I smiled, made the polite comments, nodded at the things they said, but all the while my mind catalogued every detail. Who texted whom, the timing of her calls, the way she checked her phone whenever Daniel got up, the subtle mannerisms she couldn't completely hide. Vanessa was careful, meticulous. She never raised her voice, never made an outright mistake, but habits have a way of slipping when your focus is split, and anyone who's watched a predator for long enough knows that even the sharpest ones leave traces. Then came the first real fracture. It was subtle at first. Daniel mentioned that a bonus check at his company had been delayed. Vanessa, with her usual composed tone, brushed it off as a simple administrative mistake, but the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, the way she avoided eye contact, it was almost imperceptible, but I saw it. And I filed it away. Later that evening, I got a call from my former colleague, someone who had a long memory and a surgical eye for patterns. They noticed her, he said. The audit trail is irregular. Some numbers don't add up. Not enough to trigger a legal case, not yet, but it's there. Small, but enough to suggest something more. I felt a cold satisfaction. Not joy, just the calm understanding that the first domino had been nudged. A week passed. I sat quietly in my study one evening, preparing dinner for myself, my locket resting beside the plate out of habit. The phone buzzed again. Another update from my colleague. She's nervous, tightening up, people are asking questions. She's the only one who can't answer properly. It was perfect. The timing had to be perfect. Patience was everything. Revenge, the kind I was planning, didn't rush. It didn't scream. It waited. It grew quietly, invisibly, and then it struck. But then disaster, or so I thought, struck in a way I didn't anticipate. Daniel called that night, his voice heavy with confusion. Dad, something happened at work. Vanessa, she's been called into HR. They're asking questions about contracts she handled. She's panicking, and they're looking at her emails, her approvals, everything. I smiled, but the smile was thin. Are you okay? I asked. I don't know. I feel like I don't know her anymore. I let the line go silent for a moment. That was the sound of truth, finally clawing its way through the veil of deception. I realized something important then. The fallout wasn't just going to hurt Vanessa, it was going to hurt Daniel. And I wasn't sure if I had counted on that. Parenting your child through betrayal is complicated. It's not just about punishing the wrongdoer, it's about shielding those you love from the consequences of choices they made blindly. Daniel had trusted her. He had invested years of his life, emotionally and financially, into her. Watching the realization hit him was like watching someone slowly awaken from a dream that had been carefully constructed by someone else. By the next evening, the storm had arrived. Vanessa called me. Her voice was tight, controlled, but there was a tremor beneath the surface I had never heard before. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded. I didn't answer immediately. I just placed the locket beside my plate, the familiar weight comforting. "Because someone has to," I said finally, "because some things can't just be ignored." Her panic was subtle at first, a slight quickness in her speech, the faint trembling of her hands, but it escalated. Emails I didn't send, messages she couldn't account for, and an audit that suddenly had eyes on everything. All of it compounded her fear. She tried to regain control. She tried to charm, to explain, to justify. But the web she had spun over the years was intricate, yes, but it had holes. Tiny, nearly invisible holes. And I had been watching long enough to know exactly where to pull. Daniel didn't understand it yet. At dinner, he asked her why she seemed tense. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, her eyes darting toward mine. I nodded politely, saying nothing. Let the tension build, let it simmer, let her realize the walls were closing in. By the end of the week, HR had called her in for a formal meeting. Daniel was forced to listen to the same damning evidence I had buried for years. Witness statements, irregular contracts, emails she could no longer explain. The daughter-in-law he thought he knew wasn't the woman he had married. And in that moment, the first ripple of doubt hit him. The first flicker of understanding. That perhaps his father's quiet observations were not the ramblings of a sentimental man. That perhaps his father had known more than he ever wanted to admit. Vanessa left that night in a hurry. Daniel tried to follow her, but I stopped him gently. "Let her go," I said. "She'll show you who she really is soon enough. Don't interfere. Let the truth do its work." He hesitated, then nodded, defeated but curious. I sat in my study that night, the locket once again beside me. I could hear the faint echoes of their arguments down the hall, the tension, the fear, the slow, inevitable unraveling of the carefully constructed illusion she had built. And I realized something. Revenge wasn't about violence, or shouting, or public humiliation. It was about letting someone's own choices, their own arrogance, and their own lies catch up to them. That night, as I closed my eyes, I felt a calm that had eluded me for years. For the first time since Elena's death, I wasn't just observing life. I was shaping it. And the ripple I had set in motion was only beginning. After that night, I realized that if this was going to work, patience alone wouldn't suffice. Observation was necessary, but strategy, careful, deliberate strategy, would be essential. For years, I had allowed the world to move past Elena's absence, to allow my grief to sit quietly in a corner. But now, grief had transformed. It had sharpened into clarity. It had become fuel. The first step was understanding what I was up against. Vanessa wasn't reckless. She was precise, meticulous, and clever. Every interaction, every word, every movement was measured. I needed more than just patience. I needed leverage. I needed undeniable evidence that could not be ignored, dismissed, or rewritten. I returned to the hard drive I had saved years ago. The old Bright Edge video, the one no one had seen beyond me and a handful of colleagues, was only the beginning. If I wanted to truly expose her, I needed to weave a chain of events that connected her past misdeeds to her present life. And more importantly, I needed it to hit her where she was most vulnerable. Her reputation, her marriage, and the perception of control she so carefully maintained. Over the next few days, I quietly catalogued everything I had ever noticed. Her subtle manipulations of Daniel, small lies disguised as jokes, suggestions framed as helpful advice. Financial anomalies at her company, contracts with minor vendors that had been inexplicably altered under her approval. Communications she had left exposed, patterns of secrecy that suggested she was still using the same methods that had caused her previous scandal to quietly disappear. And then there was Daniel. I knew he would eventually have to see the truth for himself, but he couldn't be caught in the middle prematurely. My son had to remain unaware of the strategy's full scope until the moment was precise. Any misstep, any hint of intervention from me too early, and Vanessa could adapt. She could control the narrative again, like she always had. So I began to reconstruct my plan in 3 phases. Phase 1, isolation. Vanessa had to feel her control weakening without understanding why. I couldn't confront her directly yet. The mere knowledge that I had been aware of her past could make her unpredictable. Instead, I used subtle nudges, small discrepancies in her financial documents, missing files at work, phone notifications strategically left visible, to begin shaking her composure. Phase 2, exposure. Once her confidence began to falter, I needed the evidence to be undeniable, irrefutable. The video, carefully stored emails, and documentation of her ongoing manipulations would be combined in a way that left no room for interpretation. By this point, HR, Daniel, and any other relevant parties would see the truth firsthand. Phase 3, resolution. This was the part that required patience above all. Vanessa had to feel the consequences of her own actions, naturally, logically, inevitably. The climax wouldn't come from my hands directly, but from her own choices and the chain reactions they set off. My role would be the silent architect, the quiet hand guiding the dominoes toward a perfect conclusion. During this period, I also spent time with Daniel, indirectly. I noticed how easily he trusted her, how he laughed at her jokes, how his world centered around her approval. That gave me insight into what would hurt her the most. Not public humiliation, not gossip, not legal consequences. What she feared above all else was the loss of control, of Daniel's perception of her, of the narrative she had crafted so carefully over the years. I started planting subtle seeds. Casual comments about the importance of honesty in relationships. Stories about past experiences where truth eventually surfaced. Articles on financial ethics and corporate transparency left on the kitchen counter when I visited. Small nudges, nothing overt, but enough to prime Daniel's mind to notice inconsistencies. Enough to make him more receptive when the time came. Then the awakening moment arrived, not for Vanessa, not for Daniel, but for me. I realized that I wasn't just executing revenge. I was reclaiming something I had lost along with Alina, my sense of agency, my power to shape events rather than being a passive observer of time slipping by. 6 years of grief, of watching my life become quiet and predictable, had culminated in this single, precise opportunity. For the first time in years, I felt fully alive. Not exhilarated, not angry, not triumphant, just completely in control. And control, I reminded myself, is something Vanessa had always overestimated in her own life. She believed she was untouchable because she had manipulated the system before, but she hadn't accounted for patience, planning, and knowledge. And knowledge, I realized, was my greatest weapon. I had her past meticulously documented. I had her current vulnerabilities observed and catalogued. I had Daniel, unknowingly ready to witness the truth when the timing was right. All that remained was to execute carefully. I spent that night late into the evening mapping out the steps on paper, every document to send, every subtle hint to reveal, every precaution to ensure Daniel wouldn't be caught in the middle prematurely. The locket rested beside the map, not as a sentimental object this time, but as a reminder of perspective, of patience, and of long-term planning. By the time I finally went to bed, I knew the awakening wasn't just about strategy, it was about transformation. I was no longer the passive, grieving father. I was the silent architect, the observer who had become the mover. And Vanessa, oblivious as she was, had already begun stepping into the trap without knowing it. The execution began quietly, deliberately, almost imperceptibly. It was the kind of move that, if observed by an outsider, would seem mundane, even accidental. But in reality, every step had been calculated months in advance. I wasn't in a rush. Rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes are the downfall of the careless, not the meticulous. It started with Daniel. I had to prepare him subtly. He had to be alert, skeptical, curious, but never alarmed. During a casual Sunday dinner, I brought up a story about a corporate whistleblower I had worked with years ago, someone who had uncovered financial discrepancies within a company and faced enormous resistance from colleagues who refused to believe the evidence. I watched Daniel's reactions carefully. His brow furrowed slightly. His smile didn't reach his eyes. That was enough. The seed was planted. Over the next few weeks, I continued to weave similar narratives into conversation. Small anecdotes, subtle reminders about the importance of transparency, the inevitability of truth catching up with people. I was careful to never mention Vanessa directly. That would have been reckless. Instead, I used examples from the news, stories from friends, the occasional book about corporate scandals. Next came the leverage. I had the video, emails, documents all meticulously organized, but handing them over prematurely would be a mistake. Vanessa was sharp, and if she even sensed the threat, she would adapt. She had done it before, quietly covering her tracks, making it seem like nothing ever happened. I had to strike where she couldn't anticipate, when she was overconfident, when she thought her past was buried forever. The perfect moment came unexpectedly. Vanessa invited me over for dinner one evening, unusually early. The house was immaculate, the table set perfectly. I noticed subtle signs, phone notifications left on the counter, documents partially visible on her desk, a laptop open to what looked like financial software. These weren't mistakes, they were opportunities. I took note of them. I let the evening unfold naturally, sitting quietly, observing. Then, at precisely the right moment, I placed the locket beside my plate. This time I didn't even look at her. The locket wasn't sentimental, it was a signal, a reminder of patience and precision. Vanessa noticed it immediately. Her eyes flicked toward it, then to me, a faint tension crossing her expression. That tension was the signal I needed. I began the first subtle strike, digital nudges. Using secure, anonymous accounts, I started sending small pieces of her past financial misdeeds to HR, carefully phrased and documented to appear as routine audits and oversight concerns. Nothing overt, nothing traceable back to me. HR began asking questions. Vanessa's calm composure started to falter. She redirected, explained, denied, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Every misstep she made, every hesitation, every evasive answer added to the chain of evidence growing stronger in HR's files. Next came the emotional angle. Daniel was watching. He noticed her agitation, her tension. He didn't understand it fully, but he could sense it. I made sure to remain composed, subtly guiding his attention toward inconsistencies. When Vanessa tried to explain discrepancies, I would nod thoughtfully, asking quiet questions that prompted Daniel to notice gaps without me explicitly pointing them out. Her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. Then came the public exposure, carefully orchestrated but indirect. I arranged for the hard evidence, the video, emails, and documentation, to be delivered securely to an independent investigator I trusted. The investigator verified the authenticity of the files, confirmed the timeline, and compiled a report. This report was then quietly sent to HR, corporate compliance, and legal counsel, ensuring that Vanessa couldn't challenge the evidence without it being irrefutably corroborated. As the dominoes fell, I watched her carefully. Her confidence wavered. She tried to maintain control, but the walls were closing in. Every carefully calculated move she had relied upon in the past now worked against her. She began making mistakes, small at first. A missed email, a poorly worded explanation, a hesitation during a phone call that would later be scrutinized. Daniel noticed. Finally, he questioned her directly during a dinner. Her reaction, panic, defensiveness, and subtle anger, confirmed what I already knew: she was trapped. But I wasn't done yet. The final element required Daniel to fully witness the consequences. I arranged for him to be present when the independent investigator presented the compiled evidence in a formal setting. Vanessa tried to deflect, to charm, to explain, but every attempt failed. The evidence was undeniable, precise, and irrefutable. Daniel's eyes widened as realization dawned. Every manipulation, every lie, every misdeed, all of it was laid bare before him. Vanessa's control evaporated in real time. She had underestimated me. She had underestimated patience. She had underestimated the quiet observation of a man who had been watching her for years. By the end of the week, her professional and personal life was fractured. HR initiated formal proceedings. Daniel confronted her privately, his tone calm but firm. Her charm, once so effective, now had no power. She realized that her past was no longer buried, her manipulations no longer invisible, and that her carefully constructed image had collapsed entirely. And in that moment, I understood the full scope of execution. Not just exposure, not just consequences, but the way in which precision, patience, and strategy can dismantle a person's power quietly, methodically, without ever raising a hand. That night I returned home. The locket sat beside my plate, just as always. But this time it wasn't sentimental. It was victorious. I thought the execution had gone flawlessly. I had anticipated every reaction, predicted every misstep, and guided every domino to fall exactly where it needed to. Vanessa was unraveling, Daniel was waking up to the truth, and my careful architecture of justice seemed unassailable. And then the first twist hit. It came in the form of a call from the investigator late one evening. His voice was measured, but carried a weight I hadn't expected. "Something come up," he said. "I've cross-checked Vanessa's past with other firms she's worked for. There are gaps, irregularities, and not all of them point to her directly, but one name keeps appearing, someone else who might have been orchestrating or at least enabling some of these schemes. We need to dig deeper before moving forward." I froze, not because I hadn't expected complications. No, in fact, I had anticipated them, but because this was a variable I hadn't considered. Someone else, another player in the shadows. For the next few days, I did something I rarely do. I panicked, just for a moment. Every carefully constructed plan relies on controlling variables, on knowing your opponents fully. And now, a hidden factor had emerged, someone I had never anticipated. I immediately began tracing her past, reviewing documents, contracts, emails, anything that could point to this hidden player. And then I found it. A shadow in the records, a consultant she had worked with during her early years at Brightedge. Quiet, unassuming, low profile, but meticulous in covering tracks. Their name had appeared only fleetingly in old emails, but the patterns were clear. Vanessa hadn't been acting entirely alone in her earlier misdeeds. Someone had been giving her guidance, covering for her mistakes, nudging decisions to avoid detection. It was a devastating revelation. Because this person, this enabler, was still active in her life. And worse, they had begun communicating with her again. I realized immediately the implications. If Vanessa had a hidden ally, the entire structure I had so carefully built could collapse. She could claim coercion, blame, or guidance from this unseen hand. She could adapt, manipulate, and recover. All my careful timing, all my subtle nudges, could be nullified if this person intervened. I had two choices: pause and reassess, or strike quickly before they could act. Patience had carried me this far. Impulse could ruin everything. But waiting too long would give the shadow time to act, time to alert Vanessa, time to regain the upper hand. I chose to move. The first step was identifying the enabler. Using my network, old contacts, and digital breadcrumbs, I traced them to a small consultancy in Boston. Someone with access to financial oversight, someone meticulous and careful, someone who had covered for Vanessa's misdeeds before. Next, I initiated controlled exposure. Not full confrontation yet, but strategic leaks, sending anonymous, irrefutable evidence to their clients, creating pressure without revealing my involvement. The goal was to destabilize them, to pull the strings carefully without letting them know I was aware of their existence. Meanwhile, I had to manage Vanessa herself. She was already fragile, teetering on the edge of panic. The sudden resurgence of this hidden player's influence was perfect for creating cracks in her confidence, but only if handled delicately. Any misstep and she could manipulate Daniel further, regain control, and turn the tables on me. So I orchestrated small, precise, accidental encounters between her and the investigator, timing them so that she would sense the walls closing in from multiple angles. Financial discrepancies she hadn't even known were being reviewed were quietly flagged. Phone logs were traced. Her old consultant's presence was hinted at without being explicitly revealed. The panic began to show. Subtle at first, twitches, clipped responses, evasive gestures, but growing every day. And then came the most unexpected twist of all. Daniel, unknowingly, became the perfect lever. As Vanessa's panic grew, she began trying to explain herself to him, to preemptively charm, manipulate, and control the narrative. But Daniel had begun noticing patterns on his own, the subtle inconsistencies in her stories, the way she avoided direct questions, the tension she could no longer mask. For the first time, he began asking pointed questions, the kind that forced her to reveal more than she intended. And with each revelation, the shadow enabler's presence became more evident, not to me, not yet, but to Vanessa. She realized too late that someone from her past was watching, someone capable of dismantling her carefully constructed world if provoked. The thrill, though, wasn't in my power anymore. It was in the perfect timing of nature's own twists. I had anticipated a certain degree of chaos, but even I hadn't expected it to escalate so dramatically. It was a test of my patience, my strategy, and my foresight. And the best part, Vanessa had no idea that her father-in-law, the man she dismissed as sentimental and powerless, had anticipated the twist before she even knew it existed. The first twist had arrived, and it had made everything far more dangerous and far more satisfying. The moment came quietly, like the shift of a tide, subtle at first, but unstoppable once it began. Vanessa, panicked and overextended, had started unraveling on her own. The hidden enabler from her past, someone she had trusted implicitly, had begun to exert pressure she hadn't anticipated. Financial discrepancies flagged, audit trails investigated, the quiet but relentless pressure of HR and compliance. It all converged perfectly. I watched it all unfold without intervening, letting the forces I had set in motion take their natural course. The first clear sign came during dinner. Daniel, who had until now been cautiously silent, finally asked the question that would mark the turning point. "Vanessa, why can't you explain these numbers?" he asked, calm but firm. Her face paled, her practiced composure cracking. I don't know what you mean," she stammered. "You've always been so precise," Daniel said, his eyes narrowing, "but something doesn't add up. And it's not just the contracts, it's everything. I thought I knew you." Her lips trembled. She tried to recover with charm, deflection, laughter, but it was too late. Her control had slipped. The truth was finally pressing through her carefully constructed veneer. This was the turning point, the moment when the villain realizes the trap is no longer avoidable. Vanessa could feel it in her chest, the walls of her empire closing in. Every carefully calculated lie, every manipulation, every small injustice she had relied upon to control outcomes now rebounded against her. And Daniel, finally seeing the full picture, began to question everything. Her reactions became erratic. She made small mistakes, contradictory statements, attempts to redirect blame, subtle attempts at intimidation, but none worked. The dominoes I had positioned so carefully were already falling. Then the enabler made their move. I had predicted some interference, but the timing was perfect. Vanessa, already destabilized, received a message from the consultant, someone who had covered for her past actions. The content was clear: "You can't hide anymore. Everything is being traced. Every move is visible." Panic spread across her face, like ice sliding down a windowpane. She realized, with absolute clarity, that the web she had spun was collapsing, and there was no one to catch her. And in that moment I acted, but subtly, not directly. I left an innocuous message for Daniel, a link to a secure folder. Inside, meticulously organized evidence of Vanessa's past misdeeds. The evidence was undeniable. Contracts, emails, the old video from Bright Edge, combined with recent discrepancies, all compiled in a way that left no room for denial. I didn't explain, didn't comment, didn't intervene. I simply waited, as any master of timing would. Daniel opened the folder, and the slow realization hit him. Every smile she had shown him, every word of reassurance, every clever manipulation, it had been orchestrated. Every trust he had placed in her, every decision he had made based on her guidance, was now revealed as part of a carefully concealed pattern of deceit. He sat in silence. I could hear his breathing even from the next room. Vanessa, sensing the shift, tried desperately to regain control. "Daniel, wait, it's not what you think." But it was exactly what he thought. And at that moment, the last thread of her authority snapped. By the following morning, the repercussions were undeniable. HR escalated the case to corporate legal counsel. The enabler's intervention had ensured the chain of evidence was watertight. Vanessa's reputation, meticulously built over years, crumbled in a single day. Daniel, for the first time, looked at me with clarity, not the dismissive glances of a son amused by an old man's sentimentality, but the sharp, questioning gaze of someone realizing the depth of my foresight. "You knew all along," he said quietly. I nodded. No words were necessary. The turning point was complete. Vanessa was trapped by the consequences of her own actions. Every attempt to manipulate, charm, or deflect had only hastened her downfall. And Daniel, finally awake to the truth, now understood that the man he had once dismissed as sentimental and powerless had orchestrated the entire revelation with quiet precision. In that moment, I felt a deep satisfaction, not from cruelty, not from vengeance itself, but from the perfect alignment of strategy, patience, and timing. The trap had closed, the villain had realized she was ensnared, and the world she had built around herself, the house, the control, the illusion of perfection, was no longer hers to command. Yet even in that triumph, I sensed another twist waiting in the wings. The world rarely allows revenge to unfold without a final, unexpected turn, and in that thought, a faint thrill ran through me. Vanessa's fall was inevitable, but the final layer, the deepest revelation, had yet to surface. I had thought I understood every variable, every reaction, every domino. And yet, just as Vanessa's world began to crumble, the second twist revealed itself, and it was far more personal than anything I had anticipated. It came in the form of a message on my phone. No number, no name, just a video file. I hesitated, knowing instinctively that it was deliberate. Someone wanted me to see it. I played it. The footage was brief, grainy, but unmistakable. Vanessa in her home office, speaking directly to someone off camera. Her words were calm, rehearsed, but one thing was clear. She had known the entire time that someone had been watching her, that someone had the knowledge I assumed I controlled. "He thinks he's in control," she said, her voice low, almost amused. "But he has no idea how deep this goes. Everything you see is only the surface." For a moment, I froze. This was not a panic-stricken woman. This was a predator calculating her next move. She had been aware of scrutiny, aware that someone was tracing her past, and yet she had hidden it, not just from HR or Daniel, but from me. The second twist wasn't external, it was internal. Vanessa had anticipated elements of my plan, some of the small mistakes she had made, not mistakes at all, carefully orchestrated distractions designed to draw attention away from the most critical evidence, the part of her past she had buried even more deeply than the Bright Edge scandal. I realized the enormity of what I was dealing with. This was no longer about exposing her for minor financial manipulations. No, this was about uncovering the full extent of her deception, the illegal schemes she had orchestrated under the radar, the lives she had subtly ruined in the pursuit of control, and the one person she had never allowed to know, someone who had been her first accomplice. And suddenly the game changed. I was no longer just the observer, I was now the hunted as well. I spent the next 48 hours meticulously reviewing every document, every email, every video I had amassed. I cross-referenced every timeline, every interaction, and then I found it. A hidden folder on an old drive, encrypted and overlooked. Vanessa had left it intentionally, or perhaps as a safeguard. Inside were records, correspondences, and photographs tying her directly to a network of financial schemes she had maintained long before Daniel ever met her. Every cover-up she had orchestrated, every manipulation she had performed to protect herself, it was all here. And in one of the files, a note addressed vaguely, as if to someone who might find it in the future. "If anyone ever uncovers this, they will see only what I allow. Control is perception. Keep that in mind." It was brilliant. And terrifying. Vanessa wasn't defeated. She was adapting. Even now, she was manipulating the perception of control, controlling the narrative even as the walls collapsed around her. She had known my moves almost as soon as I made them, and had contingencies in place. The realization was clear. I needed a new strategy. Not just exposure, not just timing. I needed to outthink her at her own game. That's when I decided to let her believe she had the upper hand. I allowed subtle hints to surface, small inconsistencies in the evidence, traces of her past misdeeds appearing in ways she could see but not control. I let her perceive that she could manipulate Daniel back into trusting her, that she might regain some control. Meanwhile, I quietly prepared the ultimate reveal, a culmination of years of observation, patience, and strategic planning. This was no longer about mere revenge. This was about perfection. And the beauty of it was this: she had no idea I had anticipated her awareness. Every misdirection she had set up, every calculated distraction, every move had been anticipated and incorporated into the final plan. She had thought she was the predator. But the true predator had been silent all along. By the end of that week, Vanessa's panic returned in full force, not because of exposure, but because she realized her influence over Daniel was slipping in a way she couldn't control. Her own words had trapped her. Everything you see is only the surface. She had underestimated one thing, the quiet intelligence of a man she had dismissed as sentimental. And that would be her ultimate undoing. The second twist had shifted everything. Vanessa's fall was no longer straightforward. It was now a game of chess, one in which every move she made, every attempt to manipulate, every lie would feed directly into the net I had been weaving for years. And in this new phase, the stakes were higher than ever. The week that followed was a study in controlled chaos. Vanessa, desperate and increasingly erratic, tried everything she could to regain control. Charm, deflection, even threats disguised as veiled warnings. But every move she made, every attempt to manipulate Daniel or HR, fed directly into the trap I had designed years ago. This was the reversed fallout, the moment when the tables, long set in my favor, fully turned against her. It began subtly. Daniel, armed with the carefully curated evidence I had provided, confronted her. Not angrily, not vindictively, but methodically. Each question he asked was precise, grounded in fact, impossible to deflect. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply presented inconsistencies, patterns, and omissions, and allowed her to respond. And respond she did, but with every word, every attempt to manipulate, she revealed herself further. Her charm, once so disarming, now only highlighted her desperation. Her composure, once impeccable, now appeared fragile, even brittle. The enabler, the consultant who had once shielded her, was exposed as well. Through careful cross-referencing and strategic leaks, their role in her past misdeeds became clear. HR and corporate legal counsel now had the full picture. Vanessa had not acted alone, but the consequences for her actions were ultimately hers to bear. She tried to spin it, tried to claim coercion, tried to insinuate that others had manipulated her, but the evidence was airtight. Contracts, emails, audit trails, video footage, and witness statements all painted the same story: calculated deceit, systematic manipulation, and deliberate concealment. And then came the public component. I had ensured that the story of her exposure would reach more than just Daniel and HR. It would reach the very people who had trusted her professionally. Carefully placed news reports about corporate audits, anonymous whistleblower accounts, and industry chatter ensured that her professional reputation crumbled. She was no longer the woman who could command trust effortlessly. Every past interaction now appeared suspect. Every connection was scrutinized. Even the social veneer she had built around Daniel's family began to fracture. Family, friends, neighbors, colleagues, once charmed by her grace and composure, began noticing inconsistencies, tension, and evidence of deceit. And Daniel. He finally saw the full picture. All the signs he had dismissed, the small evasions, the subtle manipulations, the inconsistencies, coalesced into a clear truth. Vanessa was not only untrustworthy, she was dangerous in her cleverness. And yet, through it all, he remained composed. I had prepared him well, indirectly guiding his awareness without ever directly influencing his judgment. He now understood my foresight, my patience, and my meticulous strategy. Vanessa's attempts at damage control were now futile. Every lie, every partial truth, every manipulation had been anticipated. Each action she took to regain control only reinforced the evidence against her. By the end of the month, corporate action was formalized. Vanessa was removed from all positions of influence. Her name was formally implicated in financial irregularities and professional misconduct. The enabler likewise faced professional consequences. The reversal of the fallout was complete. The predator became the prey. The woman who had once wielded power over Daniel, over colleagues, over perception itself, was now exposed, powerless, and isolated. And Daniel, my son, finally understood why I had remained silent for so long. I didn't interfere, I did confront, I didn't act out of spite. I acted out of strategy, out of patience, out of a quiet, relentless understanding that timing and evidence are far more powerful than anger. He looked at me once after Vanessa left and said quietly, "You were right all along." And I nodded, placing my hand on the familiar locket beside my plate, not as a reminder of loss, but as a symbol of precision, patience, and inevitability. The calm settled in quickly. The storm had passed. Vanessa's network of deceit lay in ruins, her control evaporated. Daniel's trust, though shaken, was now informed and resilient, and I had remained, as always, quietly at the center, not celebrated, not noticed, but fully in control. This was the power of patience, foresight, and meticulous execution. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Revenge is most satisfying not when it's loud or dramatic, but when it is perfect, complete, and utterly inevitable. The house was quiet that evening. The last traces of Vanessa's influence had been erased, not violently, not with confrontation, but with the steady, deliberate unfolding of truth. Daniel was calm, reflective, and finally fully awake to the reality he had refused to see. I sat at the kitchen table, the locket resting beside my plate as always. It wasn't a symbol of mourning anymore. It was a symbol of clarity, patience, and inevitability. Years of observation, preparation, and strategy had culminated in this quiet victory. Vanessa was gone from our lives, professionally and personally. Her manipulations, carefully honed over years, had collapsed under the weight of evidence and foresight. The enabler, her longtime accomplice, had been exposed and neutralized. Every move she made, every attempt to regain control, had fed directly into the web I had designed. No one had noticed the subtle orchestration behind the scenes. Not Daniel, not HR, not even Vanessa herself. I had been the quiet architect, the observer who had waited for the perfect alignment of timing, pressure, and revelation. Daniel finally looked at me, his voice low but clear. I don't think I've ever really understood how much you knew, or how long you've been planning this. I didn't smile, I didn't boast, I simply nodded. Some things take time, I said, and some people show you who they really are when you wait long enough. The final twist, the ultimate satisfaction, wasn't seeing Vanessa crumble. It was witnessing justice unfold on its own, orchestrated with precision and without a single unnecessary misstep. Years of observation, patience, and careful planning had ensured the consequences were inevitable. And the most poetic part, she had believed she was untouchable. She had believed her control was absolute. I placed my hand over the locket, feeling the familiar weight, a symbol of love, of loss, and now of the quiet power that comes with patience and clarity. Alina's memory, once a source of grief, had become a guide. Every decision I made, every subtle move, every carefully timed step had been in honor of truth and integrity, the things Vanessa had so arrogantly assumed she could manipulate. And as I looked toward Daniel, who was finally beginning to rebuild his trust and life, I whispered to no one but myself. Some truths wait their turn, but when they arrive, nothing can hide them. The room was still, the storm had passed, and in that stillness, I realized the ultimate satisfaction of revenge isn't in destruction, it's in inevitability. The locket gleamed faintly in the dim light, and for the first time in years, I felt peace. Justice had been served. Quietly, perfectly, inevitably. And the woman who once thought she was untouchable would never forget the lesson she learned too late.